Hello and welcome to the Three Will Podcast. This is your host Danny Ryan, and today I have here with me Bob Morris. Bob, how you doing?
Doing great, Danny. How are you?
I'm doing wonderful, and your title is Principal Scrum Master.
Yes. Yeah, it has a nice ring to it, huh?
Doesn't it? I feel after I say that I want to bow to you, or I want to do some sort of it sounds like a very official title. I like it. So what we're going to talk about today is some real-world project management topics, and I think it's always nice to sort of talk about reality. What is some of the things that you read in books, and then you have the real world, and how do we apply some of that to the real world? And we've had plenty of discussions on this podcast about process, and most folks know that we typically use Scrum on projects, which is one of the agile processes that are out there. And we actually had a conversation this morning with Rob, and we were talking about how we combine some of these different processes depending upon what we're trying to do. Now, what I wanted to talk with you was about Scrum, about how do we deal with the fact that things change, how do we continue to be flexible, what is it that we need to do in order to maintain flexibility in the projects that we have?
Yeah, so I think we'll talk about one specific aspect of how we typically execute our projects, and as you mentioned, we use an Agile Scrum project approach. And I guess this whole discussion is predicated on the point that change is sort of part of human nature, and one of the things that we commonly deal with on projects is customers, expectations get set pretty firmly up front.
Yep.
With our projects on features and functionality and costs and schedules. But the problem is that the detailed business objectives and requirements that go along with those expectations tend to change as the customer learns more about what it is we're doing, and they start seeing things actually, getting a little flesh and bone on them. So this is all about how we deal with that, because the central sort of conundrum you have is something that relates to an old project management concept. People probably are familiar with the triple constraint. Sometimes people call it iron triangle. Basically, just saying that if you've got scope, time, and cost, and that applies to any project. Doesn't matter if you're using Agile Scrum or any other approach. Mm-hmm. And typically a change in one of those areas, and the most typical change is maybe an increase in scope, it's going to impact those other areas. It can impact both of those other areas, increasing time and increasing cost. And then, the real world and expectations that customers have, that's just not a realistic way to deal with those kinds of specific changes that occur along the way. In other words, every time we have a change, we don't immediately say that these other things, time and cost, are going to have to change.
Yep. Somebody the other day threw an iron triangle at my head, and it hurt so much.
Yeah,
it can hurt you in the real.
It's heavy.
It is heavy. It is heavy. So it seems like we're gonna, it is one of those sort of tenets that you have to deal with, and with that, but change is inevitable. It's one of those things that just it happens, and how do we deal with that in the real world? Now let's talk about. I know there's a recent project that we want to sort of dive into, and let's talk about how this played out with dealing with some of those real world constraints.
Yeah, so as you mentioned at the top, one of the most common approaches we use for our projects is a Scrum, which is an agile project approach. And a lot of times there's a term that gets used a lot in agile Scrum circles called the art of the possible. And it's something that we use to describe how this approach helps us cope with those changes. Mm-hmm. And essentially what this phrase means is just all about avoiding perfectionism. Sometimes you'll hear people use the phrase "perfect is the enemy of good." Mm-hmm. And we had a recent project, and we're talking about a project that had thousands of hours of human effort involved in it. And it started out being something that it seemed relatively straightforward. A lot of it had to do with porting code from one platform to the other. But even in projects like that up front look like they're going to be pretty clean and no changes, inevitably you start getting these changes. People come up with ideas, they see new capabilities in a new platform they weren't previously aware of. The team comes up with ideas as well. It's not just the product owner. And so it's inevitable that you're going to have these changes.
Yep.
So,
yeah, and I think one of the key aspects you're hitting on is a project can fail if you're inflexible. It's one of those things. If you started out and you can be technically correct and hey, you agreed upon this and we don't like to. We typically, when we're working on projects, we do change controls, but we typically try to work with the original budget that was put in place and sort of try to add flexibility as a part of the project, and instead of trying to say, hey, you agreed to this in the beginning, we're sticking with this, and blinders on, we're moving ahead.
Yeah, and so that's sort of the philosophy, but trying to make that actually happen.
Yeah.
That's where the art comes in the art of the possible, and basically the main mechanism we use for that, something that I think everybody is familiar with that has been involved in Scrum projects in the past is the product backlog. This is that's the list essentially of the requirements that we need to fulfill in order to say we're done with this project. And we use that product backlog in a very particular way. We call it ordering the priorities. And it's something we do on a continuous basis with our customers as we go through the project. And it is what allows us to, fight the good fight in terms of, not letting perfect overwhelm, the good enough in a project. So whenever change occurs, we always respond with this technique of ordering the priorities, and it's it's basically a couple of steps. The first step, I think most people again that are familiar with Scrum are already aware of, and that is assigning a priority level to everything in our backlog. And there is a pretty standard way of doing this. We subscribe to that as well. It's called the Moscow method, which is just an acronym for must have, should have, could have. And we even have a level called won't have. And we will include things in that backlog with won't have just so we have clarity with our product owner, our customer, on things that maybe were considered but are not going to be in scope from the project. So the way normally the projects work is everything that's in that must-have category, we know we must have them in order to say that we're done with the project. Things that are in the should-have and could-haves, those are things that we might deliver if we have availability of budget and the schedule permits. So we typically try and be optimistic on those things. But the problem with stopping there is it just doesn't give enough information to the team on what they need to do day to day in the project to be efficient. So there's a second step to this, which is we actually go in, and again, this is kind of on a continuous basis with our product owner, our customer, and we order those backlog items with each of those priorities. And we review those, and basically the order tells the team what to do first. And this ordering is something that can be based on business or technical constraints. For example, we may say, well, we need to build out some development environments before we can actually start creating the first build.
Yeah.
So those two steps, that's really sort of the key that we're using here to try and bring this concept of art of the possible to the project.
So quick question.
Yeah.
So when you're doing this, we're first working with a customer and we put together the initial backlog, and then we have them at that point in time. They're the ones who decide which of those must have, should have, could have, won't have. So they're the ones who are setting that up. What stops a customer from saying I want all must have? I guess and this may be just sort of, well, if everything's a must have, then we're going to set the budget pretty high because we need to get all of that done. Then we're just factoring that into the overall time and cost of the project.
Right, and I think the key to that is we align on expectations at the beginning of the project, and that could be so we have kind of a high level backlog at the beginning of a project, and it could be that everything in there is a must have. I've seen some projects like that. It could be that there are things recognized up front that from a business perspective would be nice to have, but they don't absolutely have to have them, and so they might not be in the must-have category. But the key thing is, as we go through the project, we're working off that initial alignment of expectations, and we're very protective about making sure that both we and the customer is in agreement and alignment on what gets into that must-have category for things that end up getting added to the project. And in some cases, we'll go into a project, and again, you learn as you go. A lot of times, there'll be new items that may come into the backlog that a product owner makes a decision that, actually that's got more value to the business than some of the original things. And so this approach that we're using here accommodates flexibility as far as that goes. So as long as we've got something in must have in the existing backlog that we haven't started on, and there's no dependency on other things, they could actually pull that out and substitute something of equal amount of effort.
Okay.
And we'll just absorb that change as part of the project.
And is this where you start talking about like story points, where you say you may be able to exchange one that's of similar story points to another?
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
That and then I think it's kind of interesting that you, on the second step of this as well, it sounds like you're looking at both business and technical constraints. And I think some of the technical, what I would think there would be, you would look at like the story points. What's the estimate on this? And if it's, sometimes when you're filling up that shopping basket, you might not reach for something that is really expensive when you could get two of something else,
Mm-hmm.
So you are really factoring in both business and technical constraints to what's the order of what I'm doing.
Yeah. It essentially boils down to taking what could be very big decisions in terms of cost and time and features, and breaking it into a very small, a set of very small decisions. And then a lot of times it's much easier to make a bunch of small decisions than one huge decision.
Yep.
Certainly less risk.
And now you mentioned sort of an analogy with a house in a tropical rainforest. Tell me sort of how does this play out to that?
Well, sometimes to try and give people an understanding of why we've got these priority levels, and then we need to order those. This is something that's pretty well known, I guess, in agile project circles. Yeah, it's a house in a tropical rainforest, and I think it's predicated on the idea that there are many things you could think of that would be sort of must-have for that kind of a project, a construction project. Walls, roof, floors, all those things. And there could even be things that are should-haves, meaning maybe the decision between silver and gold-plated plumbing hardware, or 10-year and 15-year shingles. So those things sort of represent what we call the backlog, and they're really great guides in terms of figuring out what do you really need to get finished to give the most value to a customer at a predictable cost and duration of a project. But again, you could really make a mistake. For example, if you go in and the first thing you start doing is putting in floors. And then it's in a tropical rainforest, so you're going to get rain and it's going to destroy the floors. So you need that extra layer of information to order these must-have items so that you got to put up 4 posts first and then put the roof on top of that. And then you can start building the floor and the walls while you're dried in. So that's the idea of ordering within the priorities. And you also, sometimes people wonder why you're ordering things that are maybe in the should-have category. Well, as we're going through the project, if we have something in the should-have category and we have confidence that we're going to get everything that's in the must-have category finished, we want to know, well, if we have extra time, what's the very next thing we should work on? And we don't want to have to go back and have a lot of meetings and discussions. And so you order that should have list, and the team knows they can just take the first thing off the list.
The another thing I like about this is that typically we're talking like a project as a start date, end date, and typically what happens for us is we're working on maybe the first phase of something, and it might have multiple phases to it. So what I think of is these must-haves are what we have to have maybe for this first phase of the project. And what I like about this is you almost can roll very easily into the second phase, and some of the should-haves might become must-haves for that phase. But at least you're maintaining a list of, because these are this is a living, breathing creature that you're creating.
Yeah.
And with it, there's your first phase. Hey, I'm just you're really just worrying about the walls and the roof and the floors. But then the second phase, you're worried about other things that sort of pop up to the priority. But at least you've got them captured in the backlog, and you go through. And I guess that's part of the planning for phase 2 is you go through the backlog again and then sort of say what's things might be must-have that are in second phase.
Yeah. In fact, it's a good point, Danny. You talk about growth of the backlog in the should have, could have area. When we see that in a project, that's certainly not a sign of poor health of a project. That's actually a healthy project. And it provides values to our customers. Maybe they're not going to do that now, but they've got a head start on planning and understanding what really should come next and what's the next thing that could provide value, even if that's not something they're going to budget for to do right now.
Excellent. It's with having the requirements and ordering the requirements and knowing what's going to happen next. It seems like there's a better flow to the project as well.
Yeah, and it's earlier when I was talking about splitting big decisions up into a bunch of smaller decisions, is sometimes a product owner will have some other stakeholder even come in with a new idea, something that really would improve something that we're trying to deliver. But when they look at that at a detailed level and they think about, well, what will that mean in terms of trade-offs of other things? If I want to stick within my current budget, maybe I can't do that unless I'm willing to pull something else out. And it really requires them to make those kind of value decisions at a very detailed level. And they're able to do that other than just saying, well, everything that I previously identified, just do it. Here's a new thing. Tell me how much it's going to cost, and we've got to go through the change management process. So it's a lot more efficient way of trying to make those judgments.
Let's for wrapping this up, let's talk about a recent project that you had. It seemed like it had a relatively straightforward set of requirements. Tell me more about that particular project.
Yeah, so this was, it certainly wasn't one of our smaller projects. We're talking about thousands of hours of work.
I like this a lot.
and
I wish this was our typical type of project.
And, this was, I think I mentioned earlier, it was initially thought to be something that was going to be pretty straightforward. It involved, porting some code from an earlier version of an application over to a new platform.
Gotcha.
And even some of the objectives were the first priority is don't disrupt the user experience and this should be completely transparent to users. But it's inevitable when you're doing that work, you start noticing some of those little inefficiencies maybe in the application that you'd like to clean up since you're already in there working with the code. Or maybe you see a way to do something differently that could really leverage some new functionality of the new platform. Mm-hmm. And that's how those changes crept in there. And there wasn't a lot of wiggle room in terms of trying to add new things, and there wasn't a lot of wiggle room to remove things, because ultimately we had to port over all of the existing functionality to this new platform. So we had, I guess you could say, scarce resources in terms of the ability to add things or enhance things in our project. But this worked really well because it allowed us to be very, very smart with those scarce resources in terms of being able to add a few things that didn't require a lot of work but really had a lot of bang for the buck. And we were able to do that. So we ended up delivering this project. Again, it was thousands of hours, very, very close in terms of the original cost estimate, but it actually had some features and functions that were enhanced above what was in the original plan. So pretty good outcome for everybody. You know, our product owner was able to point to sticking to our budget, and at the same time, these users were happy because they saw some changes and improvements.
I love a good happy ending. Yay.
Yep.
It seems to me that your role on some of these projects is really just to report reality. You know, you're almost there. You're trying to help the client make good decisions as you're going along on this project. That's really, you're sort of like guiding them and helping them to make sure that they're doing the right things with setting priorities, with making sure what we're working on next is the next highest value thing for us to work on.
Yeah, there's a lot of people, first of all, the Scrum Master name sounds strange to a lot of people that aren't involved in this kind of work. And the most common way that I'll tell people, what it is it's a coach role. It's a coaching role. And, our philosophy here is that coaching role is not just for the three-wheel team, but it's for our customers as well. And so we don't take that responsibility lightly. And that's one of the things we do, is to help coach our customers through this process of making, these smaller decisions that lead to really good, large outcomes.
Awesome. I think it's a great way of ending this, Coach. Way to Principal Coach, or I'll just call you Coach, Head Coach.
Yeah, let's head to the showers.
Okay. And with that, let's wrap it up. Bob, thank you so much for taking the time to do this. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
And thank you, everybody, for listening today, and have a wonderful day. Take care. Bye-bye.